Hello and welcome to this webinar on UK and EU data protection compliance in clinical trials, a guide for life sciences, biotech and pharma industries. I just want to start with some introductions and a bit of housekeeping. So initially we'll just look at a broad view of what we're going to be talking about and then drill down into some key issues, the roles of the parties involved in clinical trials, what needs to go in from a GDPR perspective into informed consent forms, what needs to go in from a GDPR perspective into clinical trial agreements, what happens when you get it right, and what happens, unfortunately, when you get it wrong. And then finally, we'll look at some practical tips for getting it right. So let's get started. What are the aims of today's course? Well, really, it's to understand what compliance looks like from a GDPR perspective when you're involved in, could be conducting, it could be just participating in another way, clinical trials, and to review any best practices in relation to drafting provisions in the broader clinical trial documentation. So, as I said, informed consent forms, clinical trial agreements. And potentially master services agreements with CROs, but we'll come to those later. And then obviously there's always understanding risks, and in particular here, understanding the risks of GDPR non-compliance. So let's get started. I'd like to set the legal scene, if you like, by looking at some of the legislative landscape that surrounds GDPR in the context of clinical trials. Obviously, there's the GDPR itself, the GDPR in the EU, and the UK GDPR in the UK clinical trial scenario. We have some guidance from the EDPB, European Data Protection Board, which obviously no longer directly applicable, but very persuasive still in the UK. And that looks at, in particular, the interplay, because GDPR doesn't exist obviously in isolation. Clinical trials are heavily regulated, and principally by the clinical trials regulation. So there is an interplay between that clinical trials regulation and obviously regulation in respect of privacy and data protection.